but I'm going to talk about pesticides, not herbicides, pretty much everything. So herbicides, rodenticides, avicides, pesticides, etc., etc. Okay, so that's pretty much the problem we're looking at in the country at the moment. Sorry, this is a little bit low. What we also have to look at is not just what we have to deal with in South Africa, but how we have to implement all the South African regulations fall into international obligations. So the international obligations that we're looking at, the first one is the Rotterdam Convention, Annexure 3, which is the prior informed pesticides, and those are the ones that are generally banned internationally. And the PICs, as they're currently known, is to help countries make informed consents on whether they're going to be importing banned pesticides into the country and notifying countries of whether they're going to be exporting these banned pesticides out of the country. So the pesticide companies have to notify the Rotterdam Convention Secretariat whether they're going to be importing or exporting, and the National Designated Authority for the Rotterdam Convention in South Africa is the DFFE. That's us. Okay, the next one is the Stockholm Convention, which deals with pesticides of persistent organic pollutants, and the most well-known one that you would know of is DDT. And DDT is actually banned internationally, but still being used in South Africa, but only by the Department of Health for indoor residue spraying, mostly in the KZN bordering areas, northern KZN, for mosquito spraying. So the Stockholm Convention is to eliminate and restrict the use and manufacturing of the POPs. Okay, so the other one that we're going to be dealing with, which I forgot off the side, apologies, I did this last night, is the Basel Convention, which is deals with the transportation of chemicals with regards to empty containers and obsolete pesticides. And the one specific for the African continent is the Bamako Convention, which also deals with pesticide companies that overload, I don't want to say dump, near obsolete or near expired pesticides on the African continent. So then the pesticide, what we're going to look at, pesticides with unmanageable risk, which are basically the pesticides when you're looking at hierarchy of control, you aren't able to manage the risk those pesticides give the country or the person that has to manage them. And these are the pesticides with endocrine disrupting properties, the POPs, the PICs, the carcinogenic and immunotoxic potential pesticides, so those were the Class 1As, the highly hazardous pesticides, Class 1Bs, and by the way, there's 138 HHPs that are registered and still being used in South Africa today. And the pesticides with frequent and severe poisoning incidents, those are the arsenics and the 1As. And under the FAO's JMPR, those would be Class 8. There's 8 classes of pesticides under JMPR. And those were all the classes used by the department when we implemented our new pesticide policy. So if you're looking at the World Health Organization's classifications, the pointer is, where's the pointer again? Just above the 2 arrows. Okay, so if you're looking in the top left-hand corner, that would be the old classifications of the WHO. That has been now substituted with the new GHS, the Global Harmonization System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, otherwise known as the Purple Book. The classifications, which you will see in the bottom right-hand corner, you will notice the classification have changed from 1A, 1B, 2, 3, and U to categories 1 to 5, whereas the category 1 is the most severe, which would used to be, if you're looking at the color coding, used to be the red label, to a category 5, which used to be the U, or the blue label, which is the least severe. And what's nice about the GHS classifications is that you have to now, on your pesticide label, have the hazard statement as well. So you can't just have classification 1, you actually have to have hazardous or fatal or toxic, plus the hazard pictograms with the little skull and crossbones, or the little person with his lungs, or the little exclamation mark, etc. So the labels have to be clearly indicating the hazard statements on the labels now, so that the end user is very aware of what the hazard classification is of the pesticide before they purchase the actual pesticide. Okay, so what we also have a very problem with in South Africa is people buy pesticides that are in the same mode of action or the chemical family. So if you look at the HIRAC classification, I don't think anybody actually looks at the HIRAC classification when you purchase a pesticide. So if you're purchasing any of these pesticides in the top group, and you're using them very often, you are actually running the risk of resistance building of that pesticide, because they're all in the same HIRAC group. And that is the concern that the department has, is that if you use the same pesticide too often, even if you're substituting. So if you're using brush off and then you're swapping it with Forester and then you're swapping it back to brush off, it makes no difference because they're in the same HIRAC group. So you're running a risk of building resistance. So if you're using any pesticide in group B and you keep using those, you will build resistance not just to brush off, you'll build resistance to any of those pesticides in group B, which means then all the pesticides in group B will be then resistant. And I don't think anybody takes that into account when they're doing their pesticide management, when they're looking at how to deal with invasive species and how to actually run their pesticide management program. Okay, so our policy, we started updating it in 2012. We now finished updating it. It covers all the herbicides, pesticides, rodenticides, avicides, piscicides, etc. Because we don't just eliminate or eradicate plants. We do animals, fish, birds, etc., everything. So it's quite an all-inclusive policy. But certain pesticides are not covered by our policy, and those would be the 1As, 1Bs, arsenics, etc., etc. We took MSMA out of our policy because it's an arsenic, and we took certain of the other pesticides out of our policy, and I'll explain to you in a moment how we did it and why we did it. And our policy has a biopesticide preference. What is a biopesticide? It is a pesticide based on a natural product. And most of our biopesticides are biocontrol agents that have been produced as a commercial substitute for a chemical. An example of that would be Cylindrum basidium laevi, stump out, which is a biopesticide for black wattle, for instance. So that would be our preference. So if we're doing a control method and we're deciding we're going to want to do a cut stump on black wattle, please keep this in mind because I'm going to do a case study later and ask you these questions. What would you consider to use for black wattle as a cut stump? If you've got 5 or 6 different pesticides and you have a biopesticide, that would obviously be your first option. And then obviously we've got agreed control methods based on international best practice. Okay, so the National Environmental Management Act, which we also looked into to comply to when we drew up our new pesticide policy, encourages pesticide reduction strategies. Now, one pesticide reduction strategy is implementing the hierarchy of control, which we'll get to just now. Substitution principles, again, hierarchy of control. To promote pesticides that are less toxic. So to eliminate toxic pesticides and substitute them with less toxic pesticides. Review existing registrations. This is not our job. This is the job of Act 36 of 1947, which is the National Designated Authority for Pesticides in the country. So we just look at what is the current registrations in the country, and if we deem that there's some registrations in this country that shouldn't be registered anymore, we then request the Registrar of Act 36 to please review. Hence the 128 HHP currently registered in the country. The waste management, including the empty containers and obsolete pesticides according to the Basel Convention. This again, we are the national designated authority for the Basel Convention, but it's also a responsibility of Act 36 under Section 4.5 of Act 36. So this is a dual responsibility between the two departments. Okay, so our herbicide species spreadsheet covers the Cara and the Nemba species. There's 424 species on here. It's a one-stop shop. It changes all the time. Our pesticide policy, the Word document, only gets reviewed every 5 years, but the spreadsheet gets updated every 6 months because there's new species, there's new methods, there's different ways of doing things, so this gets updated every 6 months. So this is an Excel spreadsheet. It's a living document that changes all the time. We have 14 treatment methods, 31 formulations, 53 herbicides, 13 pesticides, and 3 herbicide categories. Remember when I said we have a little bit of a problem when you only use 3 herbicide categories and you might create resistance? That is the reason why we are opting for biopesticides as opposed to chemical pesticides at this stage. Okay, so this is just an excerpt of the pesticide policy looking at, I think I excerpted Acacia baeliana. So it gives you all the herbicides registered. It gives you how to mix it, the estimated product, the volume of the mix, etc., etc. But what I couldn't fit on the slide, otherwise you wouldn't have been able to read it. We give you a recommended product. Now the recommended product is the one that we recommend due to the HC8, the GHS, and the environmental fate and the ecotox. In other words, what's the safest herbicide to use for that treatment method, whether it's a foliar or a cut stump. We're not telling you you must use that one, but we're saying this is the safest one based on the risk assessment that we've already done for that pesticide. Okay, so based on safety, we have health and safety officers. They do toolbox talks. We also had a study commissioned by the UCT to look at the herbicide toxicity data on that, and that's also included into the new pesticide policy. And we've updated our PPE policy in line with the FAO's new policy that was promulgated in 2021, last year. So there's no more PPE one size fits all. There's a PPE per job category. So if you are a herbicide applicator for a cut stump, there's a different set of PPE. For a herbicide applicator for cut stump, for glycines, there's a spreadsheet that gives you what PPE you use for the different herbicide categories and for the herbicide mode of action. So there's no more one-size-fits-all PPE, and it's based on the exposure and the whether it's an inhalation pesticide, whether it's a dermal pesticide, etc. Because obviously the PPE will be different whether the risk is to inhalation or the risk is a dermal risk. Okay, our challenges we face is high rate of foliar applications. There's certain pesticides you cannot do a foliar application for anymore because the risk is too high. The risk you cannot mitigate. So those ones we've looked at the hierarchy of control and either said to either change the behavioral controls or the engineering controls for certain pesticides, and that's in the policy. Staff not wearing PPE correctly. PPE is the last option that you look at when you're doing engineering controls and hierarchy of controls and pesticide management. Because when it's hot, people do not wear their PPE. They stick it on their head, they take it off because it's hot. So when you're saying, oh, I'll just give them a pair of gloves, I'll just give them an overall, I'll just give them a pair of goggles. No. If the risk of that pesticide is inhalation, and you know that the risk is that their face has to be covered, and it's hot, rather take out that pesticide out of your management program, because they are not going to wear the PPE. So that risk will not be able to be mitigated. And then herbicide companies not disclosing carcinogenic or toxic adjuvants. But according to the new herbicide chemical agents regulations in South Africa, promulgated in March last year, if the adjuvant is toxic and is carcinogenic, or it can cause problems, that adjuvant now needs to be disclosed on the label. And all labels, according to the GHS, have got until, the pesticide companies have until October this year to change all their labels, according to the new HCA regulations. I think that is very exciting. Okay, so how do we improve to get people safe, people protected, and the environment protected? Measures to mitigate risk. So when you're drawing up your pesticide policy, the first thing you need to think about is, how do I mitigate the risk to the environment and to people? That's your first thing you need to think about. The outcomes from the research regarding to the toxicity. Always think about, how toxic is this pesticide, and can I mitigate the toxicity, yes or no? If the answer is no, you eliminate that pesticide. You do not use it. Because if you cannot mitigate the risk, don't use it. And be aware of the potential risks of that pesticide. If you're not aware of the potential risks, you can't come back later and say, oops. Because some pesticides that have endocrine disrupting potential and have got mutagenic and tetrotoxic potential, that damage is done. You cannot undo it. It's like ringing a bell. A bell can't be unrung. And with some of the properties of some of these pesticides, you cannot go back and say, okay, I'm going to fix it, because some of it cannot be fixed. So please think about this before you actually implement it. And use alternate methods. Biocontrol, brashing. There's a lot of species that you can use other methods for. So don't always think pesticide first. Pesticide is not always the option. There are lots of species that are under biocontrol that can work. And out of those 424 species on our pesticide policy, 13 are completely under biocontrol. So use biocontrol. Look at the hierarchy of control, which I'm going to put through a case study now. And then also look at engineering. What about bioencapsulation? Pesticide companies out there listening to me. What about different methods? What about not doing soluble liquids and emulsifiable concentrates, and rather doing different concentrations and different formulations that are safer for the applicator? Has anybody done an environmental and social risk assessment before you've actually done implementation of your pesticides? ESRAs are important. You need to do an ESRA of your active ingredient before you actually implement your pesticide management programs. And then for the mitigation of this, has anybody implemented biobeds for the mitigation to the environmental impacts of the pesticide residues that you leave on the ground after you've actually done all your applications? What about exclusions and buffer zones? When you've sprayed, do you actually do an exclusion zone so that you're not impacting the communities around your zones where you're spraying? What about buffer zones? Has anybody thought of mitigation measures with regards to this sort of spraying? Now the case study. That is a hierarchy of control diagram. The first thing you do, look at your pesticide list. If it's a really hazardous pesticide, eliminate it. Right, you've eliminated it. Now I need something else in its place. So what do? You substitute. So you replace the hazard. Now you have to do your engineering controls. How do you do your engineering controls? You isolate the hazard from the people. This you can do in various ways. You can change the formulation of the pesticide. So in other words, instead of doing people throwing soluble liquids out of 5-liter or 20-liter cans into a knapsack sprayer, what about encapsulating that pesticide in like an aerial boliki like you do with your washing powder, so that you have dissolvable capsules that you put in your knapsack sprayer. So you're isolating the hazard from the person. What about granules? Granules in little bags that dissolve. So you do your engineering protocols. Next, you do your administrative controls. Change the way the people work. When you're doing a knapsack and a foliar application, what do? You give them a knapsack, you give them a lance, they spray in front of them, and then they walk through the mist of the pesticide they've already sprayed. Why don't you give them a back-mounted knapsack, where they spray and they walk forward and they're spraying behind them, so there's no risk of them walking through a mist of pesticide. Change the way people work. What's right at the bottom? Right at the bottom. PPE. Why? Because it's the least mitigatable risk. Why? Because people and behavioral controls, you cannot change people's behaviors in certain ways. So PPE, no, you don't start with PPE. PPE is your last option when you're looking at control and mitigating risk. Okay, so here's how we did it. We started and we eliminated 5 highly hazardous pesticides. Done, gone, out. Now what? Here's the ones we substituted. Okay, so we took out MSMA. Why? That was our biggest cactus control pesticide. Went to the pesticide industry and I said, I'm not buying MSMA anymore. Done, klar, finished. Because it's got an arsenic in it and people are getting sick. Give me something else. It took 3 years, but we had got something registered called Impala, which is safer for the environment and safer to human health. So we got Impala registered. Next step, Garland and diesel, bane of my life. First of all, very damaging to the environment, and Garland, very damaging to human health. So I said, no, take out. No longer using Garland and diesel. Find me something else. Back to the industry. Need something else for Garland and diesel, please take it out. Industry came back and said, okay, Turbidor. So they got Turbidor, we got it registered. So now we've got Turbidor. Next one. Guys can't spray glyphosate with polyethoxylated toluamine in from the air. No, enough. Find me something else. Went back to the industry, they found me something else, Sendero. So now I've got Sendero to spray on prosopis and black wattle and everything else from the air. No polyethoxylated toluamine in, which is carcinogenic. Nice and safe. Right. Tick, tick, tick. Next. What's up? I need something for herbicide assistance, please. I'm tired of the mixing in water. There's no water in certain circumstances. People can't, and I don't want to keep mixing water and having overspray. I want something that you give me something and a paintbrush, I want them to paint it on. Right, back to industry. Guys, I need something that landowners can just not overmix, not overspray. I want something that you can just paint on the stem. Right, kaput gel. Ready to mix, ready to thing. All you need is a little kaput gel blikkie and a paintbrush. Done. There's no overspray, there's no mess, there's no environmental damage. Done. What's next? Now it's my aquatic weeds. Guys, I don't want to kill the frogs anymore. I need something that I can do on aquatic weeds. Yes, I know there's the big brouhaha about glyphosate at the moment. So please, I need something safe for the aquatic environments that doesn't have polyethoxylated taloaminine, that I can spray at a sublethal spray, that I'm not going to kill my biocontrol agents in. Got CBC involved, Center for Biocontrol, and I said, let's do tests. I want to know at what concentration of a sublethal spray can I spray kilomax or seismic at that I'm not going to kill the biocontrol agents. We found the dosage. We found the two. Right, kilomax and seismic. So right, now we've got a pesticide or a herbicide to spray water hyacinth with or to spray floating macrophytes with. We know what to spray at what the sublethal dose is it, and we're not killing the biocontrol agent. So now we can do strip sprays of water hyacinth on our systems, and we can boost the biocontrol agent populations on those dams at the same time, 2-for-1 bonus. So what did we do? The steps taken were to mitigate the risks that we were facing and to lessen the impacts that were needed to implement the policy. So our main aim was save the environment, save the people. That was the main aims of the policy. And then the other thing was there were some that we could not mitigate properly. So there's certain pesticides we still need to use. So we need to say, okay, well, now we need to do biomonitoring of those pesticides. So how do we do that? So we implemented biomonitoring into our occupational health and safety programs. So we can then monitor the body burden or the biological exposure indices of those people on the frequencies and durations of their pesticide spray operations to ensure that we are not impacting their health when spraying those certain pesticides. And that's in line with the GHS and the HCA regulations. So again, PPE is the last step you use when protecting people and implementing a pesticide policy. Okay, if you want to follow the PPE guidelines for the FAO with regards to PPE, please do take down that. That's where you will find the PPE policy. Or you can just take down my contact details on the last slide, and I will happily email it to you. Okay, so this is what you're going to remember. Look at the species on the spreadsheet. This is now when you are going to now start putting your pesticide policy together. You look at the species on the spreadsheet, and you choose the species you want to control. That's your first step. Then you look at the list of the herbicides registered for that species that you want to control. And you look at the recommended safest herbicide, okay? Ensure that you look at the hazard criterion for each pesticide, the human health and the environmental risks, and ensure that you mitigate with engineering controls, behavioral controls, or PPE, and then you do a risk assessment. Okay, so that's the process you follow. Okay? And that site at the bottom there is the pesticide properties database where you can get all the information you would need to do a risk assessment. Or you can just contact me and I'll walk you through the steps. Okay. Here's your thing. Okay, here's black wattle, okay? Now you choose, there's your species, okay? There's the herbicides registered for black wattle. Now you're going to start doing your risk assessment, okay? So which one would you choose? I've given you there's your species. You're wanting to do a cut stump on this species. There's the one herbicide. There's the second one. There's the third one. There's the fourth one. There's the fifth one. Here is the hazard criterion. Hatchet has got 2 hazard criterion. So hatchet is acutely toxic to mammals and birds, and it is persistent in the soil. So it's hazard criterion 2 and 8. And it's harmful to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. Okay? Plenum has a criterion 2, so it's acutely toxic to mammals and birds. It's harmful if swallowed and inhaled, and it's also harmful if swallowed or inhaled and in contact with skin. Okay? It's a hazard criterion 3, so it's a carcinogen, and it has a respiratory irritation. It's a hazard criterion 6, so it's an endocrine disrupting chemical. It causes damage to your lungs. It's a hazard criterion 7, so it is harmful to aquatic organisms with long-lasting effects. And it's a hazard criterion 8, which is persistent in soil and water. And so harmful to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. Access is a hazard criterion 2, acute tox to mammals and birds, harmful if swallowed and inhaled. It's a hazard criterion 3, it's a carcinogen, respiratory irritation. Hazard criterion 6, EDC, endocrine disrupting chemical, causes damage to your lungs. Hazard criterion 7, acute tox to aquatic organisms. The AIDS 400 means it's very toxic. And hazard criterion 8, harmful to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. Confront is hazard criterion 2, acute tox to mammals and birds, harmful if swallowed, and it causes damage to your kidneys and organs, and it causes allergic reactions. Hazard criterion 5, it's a developmental and reproductive toxogen. It can damage your unborn child. Hazard criterion 8, persistent in soil and water, harmful to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. Temporal is a hazard criterion 2, aquatic tox to mammals and birds. It causes eye and skin irritation and respiratory irritation. It's a hazard criterion 8. It is persistent in soil and water, harmful to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. Which one will you choose? And this is just an example of all the pesticides you use often, yes? No? But what did I write right at the bottom? Did anybody notice? What about biopesticides? Stumpout is registered for black wattle as a cut stump. So how many people use Stumpout? Thank you, Pam. Stumpout is available from the ARC Friedenberg Laboratory from I think he's a professor now, Alan Wood, and you can contact me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. I told you, she knows everything about this stuff. And why would anybody want to use any of those chemicals? Just no idea. But it's exciting that packaging has to change and people will be more informed. Right. So let's give the lady in the front chance first, quickly, please. There we go.
Hi, I'm Melissa Dalton. I drive Precious Tree Project. I'm Vice Chairman of the Toes River Conservancy. I'm on the George Municipality Tree Policy Program and Committee, and I'm Chairman of WALEAF. So I wanted to find out, I live in Wilderness Heights, and we have quite a lot of little small holdings above 5-6 hectares. Some of them are in the agricultural zone too, so a lot of inhabitants are taking it upon themselves. And this is not just the commercial farmers and farmer owners in Hookville and the Toes River Conservancy to use a whole lot of pesticides irrespective of the consequences. What do I do if I know that my neighbor is growing 5, maybe 50 square meters of avos, or he's growing a whole lot of stuff, or he's using pesticides that are in a category that we want to avoid? even though he has been told? What are the ramifications? Are there warning letters? What can we do?
Yeah. Act 36, and they'll stand out an extension officer. The other one is to actually notify one of Stian's EMIs. Stian, he's sitting right in front of you, one of his EMIs.
That people rather use the old ones, or don't they know about these new biopesticides?
It depends. There's different categories of biopesticides. The ones I'm referring to are basically biocontrol agents. They're mostly fungicides, if you can call them that, but they're basically biocontrol agents. Like the one for black wattle is Cylindrobacterium livei. It's fungal spores you put in a normal, let's call it salad oil, cooking oil, and you spray it like you would a herbicide onto the cut stump. And we have had success with biopesticides in varying forms. Another example is Hack Attack, which is a biocontrol biopesticide for Hackia, for instance. So there are success stories with the biopesticides, and we're aiming to go more natural, because as you see, some of the pesticides do have impacts, but you can mitigate. As I've said, you can mitigate against some of the risks to the biopesticides by changing your how the people work. So some of those, for instance, like with the ones with the EDCs and reproductive to women, just don't change who sprays. So then, for instance, with Timbrel, I suggest that you don't have women spray Timbrel, for instance. So, you just use your common sense when you actually doing how you're working out your properties. Excuse me, but just by giving them a dust mask is really not going to mitigate the risk. So and then do a risk assessment, and also just note that a lot of those have impacts on aquatic organisms. So none of those really can be sprayed near a river, if anybody noticed that. So a lot of them you can't spray near a river because they have impacts on aquatic organisms with long-lasting effects. So spraying a tree that's standing in a river system is really, not a good idea.
Love your passion and your decisiveness on the subject, and also the fact that you are actively encouraging people to use less chemicals in the invasive plant sector than we've previously been accustomed to. The first stop for us is, okay, do we have the right poisons? Waar is die gif? And people are happy when the herbicide store is full, and it looks like you're trending towards actually keeping minimum requirements for maximum impact. But I've got a couple of questions. Are there still toxic pesticides on the state tender? I'm just going to read through them because they're not difficult questions. Picloram, it's the active ingredient in mafia. It is still everywhere. I see it all over the place. What are your thoughts on that? Then Turbidor we tried on Tree of Heaven, Ailanthus altissima. I cannot find a herbicide that kills Tree of Heaven. I've tried 4 different herbicides, 6 or 7 different methods, and they keep coming back. It's a bit of a nightmare. And then the pH of the soil. Have you looked at, are you aware of any research that suggests altering the pH of the soil reduces coppicing in species like black wattle and blackwood?
Okay, first the state tender. Was the question, are there still toxic pesticides on the state tender? Yes. Sadly, yes. The other question was?
With regards to the pH of the soil.
The Picloram. Okay. Picloram, there's studies coming out of the EU at the moment that there's some seriously toxic properties to Picloram with inhalation risk. So what I've done is I've said Picloram as a cut stump is fine, Picloram foliar no.